Oops, I did it again. Chop and extend is a process where I take a plant that has reached the top of its moss pole, I chop the plant and pole in half, I take the top part, pot it back up and re-extend it. And the idea is to continuously let the plant grow up a moss pole while keeping it at a manageable height. Now I like to work with the top part of the pole because that's the part that has the newest growth, the newest leaves, most likely the largest leaves. But what happens to the bottom part? Well, there's a couple of options, and in today's video we're going to perform a chop and extend on my variegata Monstera deliciosa over here. We're also going to extend the bottom part and we're putting it outside in my courtyard to see whether the plant is thriving even more in an outdoor setting. And I'm going to address any alternatives to what could be done with the bottom part. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Well, you heard the intro, that's exactly what we're gonna do today. And the last chop and extend hasn't even been a full year, so the plant has taken less than a year to climb up that 90 centimeter top part of the pole. However, I haven't really seen a significant increase in leaf size, which, you know, is unfortunate. I mean, this is the small form of Monstera deliciosa, but it still can grow larger than what it does right now. So I thought, as part of this next chop and extend, why don't I actually keep the top and the bottom, and I put the top back in the spot. It's in that corner that's looking really empty right now. That's usually where it grows, just in an east facing window so it gets nice sunrise. And the bottom part I'll also re-extend and I put it outside where it gets even more light, and see if maybe the outside conditions are suiting this plant a little bit better. Now, I don't know if it's going to do well outside all year round, but at least the next 4 to 5 months are still going to be just fine out there. Now, in preparation for this chop and extend, I have cut this plant right here, but I just noticed that I should have cut it here. My 180 centimeter moss poles are always made out of two parts, two 90 centimeter moss poles, and they actually intersect here. So I should have chopped this node, not this one, but YOLO, let's see what we can do with this. With my Monstera deliciosa, it's definitely the craziest when it comes to aerial roots over here. Specifically at the, oh my god, I think that top leaf is going to be completely destroyed by the time we're done. My ceilings are so low. Specifically the bottom part, right? Crazy amount of roots, which also means that we will have, Bradley, can you move a little bit? Just a tiny bit. Which means that we'll also probably have to chop through some roots, but that's okay. Now, the reason I already cut the stem in half is so that it can callus over, because the top part is now being potted up into a pot, and that could potentially induce rotting, and that's not what we want. We don't want rot. So I cut it maybe a week ago or so. You know what I'm going to do? It's stupid because I just basically have to undo all of my work, but I'm going to chop this over here. I'm going to have to re-chop, and I'm going to chop here, which means I have this single cutting over here, and then obviously I have this line. So this is probably going to reshoot. You can actually see it already slightly activated the butt over here, as a result of me chopping here. And I have this one single node that's just going to be in the pot. So we'll see, maybe it will reshoot and I'll end up with another little baby coming out the pot. Most likely it will, unless it completely rots away, given that it is basically fully buried. Okay, so I removed the cable ties. And unfortunately I just have to chop through the pole over here. There's too many roots. Ah, easy. Alrighty, that's looking really good. Suppose, you know, you can see now this is a fresh cut. I would have preferred a calloused cut, but it is what it is. What we can do is I'll park this on the side just for now. We'll focus on the bottom part first. That just buys the top at least a little bit of time. Now, not much we need to do over here really, because the plant is already set. I mean, obviously it is quite root bound. I can pick it up a little bit better now. It is very root bound, but it's okay. Monsteras usually don't mind being a little root bound. Now what I'm going to do is I'll just take a new moss pole It's actually not a new moss pot, it's the one that was recycled from a plant that didn't make it. And I just extended, that's it. I used the garden stake to cable tie this pole to it. It also gives it stability and stops the pole from bending or like just flopping over when the plant is getting too heavy. And then, just so these poles can't like twist on top of each other, I'm going to cable tie the two poles together. And while I do that, let's address what I usually do with the bottom part. Most of the times what I do with the bottom parts of my poles is I actually give them to friends, because they can just re-extend it and then they have a nice plant pretty much instantly. It's much faster than starting your own moss pole from a single node cutting initially, right? Because think about it, this bottom part has many healthy leaves, this bottom part has ginormous roots, but I just took away the top part. The top part is where this plant was sending all of the growth hormones into to grow. So now the plant has a whole lot of potential to produce energy, a whole lot of potential to absorb nutrients and water, but nowhere to send all of this. So it's going to redistribute the growth hormones into the top node, sometimes even the top two nodes. They're going to activate and then they're going to regrow. And they're going to regrow much larger than a single node cutting would ever do, right? I'm planning on doing a video about like size of cuts in general, because I get asked that a lot. If I take a cutting like this, will it be juvenile and so on? I think rule of thumb is the larger the cutting, the larger the next leaf will be, right? If you take a teeny tiny cutting of a small leaf with a small stem, then the next leaf that's going to grow from that cutting is going to be really small. If you take a large cutting with large leaves, then the next leaf will be larger. The more nodes are within each cutting, the larger the next leaf will be. If I take single node cuttings, the leaf will be a little bit smaller than if I take double nodes or triple, or in this instance I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Because I have 9 nodes with 9 leaves, there's obviously more potential for the plant to produce energy and then send out a decent sized leaf. This is so not straight, is it? It's not just the size of the cutting and the size of the leaves, it's also about the root system that this cutting has available. If you take an unrooted cutting, that cutting now needs to spend a whole lot of energy in re-establishing a root system rather than taking that energy and growing a new larger leaf. In this instance I have a cutting that is very large and it has a root system in proportion to this cutting, because every single node comes with its own root system facilitated within the moss pole. So there's basically no need for this plant to now re-establish a root system or put any energy in the root system, but instead it can take all of its energy that it has and can still produce and put it straight into the shoot. At least that's the theory. But what we're going to do, I take it out and I water it, but I'll keep it outside on my wall of aeroids in my garden. And we're in summer now over here. I'm actually worried about it being maybe a little bit too hot and too sunny out there, but we'll see how we go. Yeah, but the idea is that we check in a couple of months' time and we see what this bottom part has actually done and how large the reshoot is and how long it's going to take. So I suppose we stay tuned for that. Now let me park this on the side while I work on the next part. Just to illustrate this again, see this one single node cutting will just be at the bottom of the pot now. So it will be interesting to see if there's a new shoot coming out or if that's just going to rot away. So it's a very chunky aeroid mix, mainly bark, pumice, perlite, cocoa chips, not many water retentive components. And I'm actually going for a 25 centimeter pot, because we've seen the pot before. It was very root bound, so I think it wouldn't harm to have a little bit more space for this plant in here. And I don't know why I'm making such a mess with it. It's almost like I love the cleanup. I won't compress it, but I'll pot it up with a little backwards tilt to counteract the forwards facing leaves. Now what I also want to do over the next few months as this plant is growing, I want to make sure that any sort of roots like this that are sticking out, I'm going to funnel back into the pot, right? Like these ones over here. But let them grow a little bit further first. Sometimes what I do as well, if I have a root like this, I'll just push it back into the pot like that. Now we just got to follow the same process with this plant over here. We're putting a garden stake in the back. We're filling this gap with a little bit of extra moss, and we put the extension on top. See this node over here? I want to make sure that this node has something to attach to. That's why this was well overdue chop and extend. Monsteras grow roots throughout the whole stem, so there are mainly anchoring roots, but because they're growing roots all throughout the stem over here, you really don't want this to grow too far off the pole, because then you have all of these roots kind of wasted. Alright, and same process, I also connect the two poles again over here using a couple of cable ties. And I have more detailed tutorials about my chop and extend in my moss pole playlist. Now, I was talking about the options about the bottom parts. So what I showed you do earlier, that was option number 1. I normally don't do this for my own sake. I normally give it to friends and tell them to re-extend their bottom parts of the pole, right? Basically, I give them a head start. Now the bottom parts, of course, they're old and the leaves will deteriorate, but as I mentioned, it's more like a head start for them to have a fairly established plant much quicker than starting from a single node cutting or something like that. See this over here and how it's starting to come off the pole? That's not what we want. We want this plant to be in the middle of the pole over here. So what I can do is I can take a chopstick and use the grid and be like, oh, I want you to go here. Now make sure that the chopstick comes out the end as well, so that the so that the plant can't push it away. But now this chopstick is basically telling this plant, you can see, like earlier it was sticking out in the side, now it's no longer sticking out. And as soon as there's roots going in here, I can then get rid of the chopstick. So it's not going to stay in here forever, but I found this to actually be the least intrusive way of managing the growth. Alrighty, also you can see I didn't connect anything with the pot. I can just pick it up because magic. Sorry, got really distracted by that little chopstick hack. Other option with the bottom part is to chop it up and use the propagation benefits of the moss pole. Because as I mentioned earlier, every node has its own little root system within the moss pole. That also means that, well, basically every single node is already rooted. So if you now cut single node cuttings or double node cuttings, whatever you want, they're already rooted. So the riskiest part of propagation, the re-establishment of a root system, is already taken care of. So what I often do if I want to propagate a plant that's already on a moss pole, I just chop in between the nodes, but I keep it on the moss pole. And I've done that with a Monstera deliciosa before. I've done it with a plastic backed moss pole, and it was actually cocoa chunks in there instead of moss, but the principle is the exact same. And I'll link that video down below as well. I had 100% propagation success, and it's just a really easy, space efficient and risk-free, more or less risk-free way of propagating plants. But I have many variegated monsteras already, and I don't necessarily want any smaller ones. I want maybe a second large one that stays outdoors year round. The other benefit of choosing to go down the single node or double node cuttings, or just cutting it, especially with variegation. This variegated Monstera doesn't actually have the best variegation, but I took some propagations and the propagations are amazing. So by me propagating it, I actually managed to get a nicer variegated plant out of it as well. Anyway, enough for now. We'll see each other in a couple of months' time, or however long it might take to see some results. Bye! And we are back. It has been 3 months since the chop and extend, and here we are. This is the bottom part as well as the top part. Both were extended, both grew, so let's assess the results. And let's start off with the top part first, because that's the part that I normally like to grow, right? So that's my normal process. Now, this plant has actually had a bunch of issues since then. When I chopped it, it was the end of December. So really the peak of summer over here, or like the beginning of the peak, right? So December, January, and sometimes the beginning of February can still be very, very hot. We've had multiple 40-degree hot days and so on. However, this plant is inside, so it's not so much subject to the heat. Hello, baby. But it is still subject to natural light. This plant is only relying on natural light. It's in my east-facing window over there, and it actually got burnt through the window by the morning sun. Let me show you this. I think this leaf shows it quite well over here. You can see these little burnt patches over there. Yeah, I think specifically this leaf, a little bit maybe this leaf as well. This one was the first new leaf that it unfurled over there, and I suppose it got a little bit burnt. But also you can see some more damage over here, for example. This is actually thrips. So this plant also had thrips. You can definitely see the burnt and the thrips have left a few visual marks on some of these leaves. Overall, nothing too terrible though. I got on top of the thrips using my contender spray, and you know what, it happens every now and then. Now, I think the reason why it burned was obviously because it was the harshest Australian summer sun, but also when this plant grows up and it's at the top of the pole closer to the ceiling actually gets less light exposure in an indoor setting. So when I chopped it and then I took the top part and potted it back down is where it gets way more direct sun exposure through the window because, well, the sun shines this way, not this way, right? So I think it just got burned because the bottom part was in that same position the whole time and didn't necessarily bother, but the bottom part had time to get used to that increase in light exposure as we're heading towards summer because it was there the whole time, whereas the top part was kind of more shaded while we're approaching summer, and then within one day I suddenly put it in a much sunnier spot. So it's not necessarily that the spot in itself is too sunny, I just didn't give the plant enough time to adjust to the increase in light as a result of being chopped, right? So that's actually something I've never really encountered before. I feel like I just got fortunate about it, but also these days I mainly rely on grow lights. It's one of the only plants indoors that is actually relying on natural light. So it's a good reminder that, hey, you know, with natural light, you also can burn your plants even inside. And there wasn't even a north-facing window, it was just an east-facing window, right? But of course Australia is, I think, in a bit of a unique position when it comes to the strength of the sun. We are known for having extremely harsh sun. Now let's have a look at this. This is the extension. Remember my little chopstick trick? That worked a treat. The plant has since managed to grow into the extension. So the extension starts from here. So anything from here upwards is new growth. And we can see some roots going into the pole as well, and now with the newest nodes as well. I could just repeat the chopstick trick just to kind of keep it in that spot that I want it to be in, but it looks to have found that spot more naturally now anyway. I do think this one was kind of a significant reduction in leaf size, but I think we can also partially maybe blame thrips for that one. And then over here, definitely not the biggest leaves it has ever grown, but also not terrible. Sometimes I think too much sun might also not necessarily bring out the biggest leaves in the plant, because the plant also doesn't want to expose too much of itself to that harsh sun, so sometimes they grow smaller leaves. It has grown 2 leaves in those 3 months. That's obviously not super fast, but also keep in mind in those 3 months it would have had to re-establish a root system, at least within the pot, at least a little bit. So kind of expected. Nothing unusual. I think the only unusual part was really that it got burnt inside. I did not really see that coming. Now let's focus on the bottom part. So that's the part that I normally don't keep, or the part that I usually chop up into single nodes and so on. But this one was outside on my wall of aeroids the whole time, so obviously it was also subject to these really harsh summer days that we've had. Because it is quite low, I don't actually think it got that much direct sun. I actually think that this plant that grew indoors got more direct sun, specifically in the morning, than this plant has ever gotten. It is in a somewhat shaded place in my garden and there's a big tree above it. The afternoon sun is really that is super harsh in my garden, but in the afternoon the sun comes from basically behind the plant, and the plant is shaded by the fence, specifically as it is still quite low. So I actually reckon this got less direct sun, but it got more bright light throughout the entire day. There was crazy winds, there was hailstorms, as I mentioned, a couple of heat waves. We went down to 30% humidity the other day, down from about 95%. So this plant has gone through quite a bit and it's coping okay. Of course, I'm seeing quite a bit of damage on some of these older leaves, but to be honest, I think some of this damage was already here as well. Keep in mind that these leaves are just a little bit older than the ones on the plant that I showed you earlier. But I have no light induced damage, and I also don't have any pest damage on this one. Now let's talk about the interesting part. obviously this plant, got chopped over here. So the plant has to redistribute the growth hormones. Unfortunately, it only activated one shoot. You can see this one is the second shoot. It kind of poked out a little bit, but never really developed. Instead, it put all of its efforts into this reshoot over here. So you can see this reshoot has already grown super nice thick roots towards the pole. Now just need to kind of grow into the pole, but they'll do that naturally. I might actually try, you know what, you think you didn't need the chopstick over here? I might give you the chopstick. Not that I'm short on chopsticks, but who knows. Just a little bit. Ideally, I do this when it's dehydrated, but YOLO. Okay, just a little bit, and then maybe next time a little bit more, just to bring it back onto the middle. Just quickly wanted to point out that the reshoot of that stem is quite thick. And it comes back to what I said in that initial video, right? If you take a single node cutting, a small single node cutting with a skinny stem, the reshoot is going to have a tiny thin stem. If you take a thick stem like this one and you cut it and you give that piece of stem or that cutting enough leaves and roots to support it, it's going to reshoot really thick. There's hardly any reduction in stem size, and stem size usually determines the leaf size. Now, I saw this thick stem and I got really excited, but then it sent out this first leaf. So on first impression, you'd be like, what is this? Oh my God, this was a total failure. It's fully juvenile. It doesn't even have a fenestration, hardly any variegation. Not that the variegation is really a sign of maturity, but that's just another disappointment, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with what I'm trying to say. I saw the size of the stem and I knew this leaf is not necessarily an indication of my propagation success. I knew that this plant is going to recover really quickly. And this is the second leaf that it has now grown. It's still unfurling, it's a bit soft, so flopping around a little bit. Huge, much larger than the leaves on my original top part over here. Unfortunately not showing, sorry baby, unfortunately not showing the best variegation ever, but that has nothing to do with this actual experiment. That's kind of a random thing that we can't necessarily control. So basically the difference here is that this one did not need to re-establish a growth point, right? This one already had the new leaf inside of the petiole of the previous leaf, and I didn't chop anything there. The chopping over here was done at the bottom part. So this plant needs to put a bit of effort into re-establishing a root system, but because it already has roots within the pole, not necessarily big of a concern. The newest leaf over here can continue growing as if nothing happened. It's not necessarily being stopped in development or doesn't need to redevelop or something like that. So as a result of that, you basically don't really notice a huge drop in leaf size or a change in leaf shape, right? Because we're just going about our business as usual. Nothing happened to this part of the plant that actually produces the growth. This one, quite the opposite. We kept all of the roots that this plant had, but we chopped off where all of the energy and growth is directed to. We chopped off the growth point. So this plant fundamentally needs to re-establish a growth point. And when re-establishing a growth point, it is totally normal to have the first leaf being very, very manky. There is actually a professional term for this, which I don't remember. But what I'm saying here is that you cannot judge your propagation success based on the first leaf. This ginormous leaf, the biggest leaf ever, followed this really manky, tiny leaf. And that is, of course, also subject to the conditions, but it is just the way that these plants regrow. The first leaf will most likely have some deformation and won't really be true in size. Even if I would grow these in the same conditions rather than having one inside, one outside, that phenomenon would still be experienced. However, I do think that because of the conditions being so great outdoors, this second leaf is exceptionally big, right? I did not expect it to be this big and this mature. I would have expected something more along the lines of this, kind of being on par with the top part. I didn't actually expect it to outperform, but I think the outperformance is really because of the improved conditions out there. Now, of course, these were the best 3 months to grow outdoors in Australia. I started this experiment at the perfect time to give the part that goes outside the best chances of actually growing. If I would have started this half year later, at the beginning of winter, I reckon I would have still seen some growth, but I reckon it would have taken me longer and it wouldn't be as large, right? So of course the actual size is then still subject to the conditions that the plant is grown in, and I think it was just grown in really good conditions. But I think if we are looking at it over a year, let's say, if I continue this experiment for another 9 months, I reckon eventually they'll just kind of end up at the same level again, right? This plant is going to have a harder time during winter, while this plant is still going to get nice warm temperatures and nice morning sunrise during winter. So it will still grow during winter, whereas this plant is probably going to grow less over winter and then more over summer. So I reckon over a 12-month period, ultimately we'll end up experiencing very similar amounts of growth for these two plants. So I wouldn't necessarily say that outside is my preference year round, but I think outside is definitely my preference in summer. It's just much easier to grow out there, if the plant of course can tolerate the harsh conditions. So what did we learn? I think first learning I made loud and clear: you can't judge your propagation success based on the first leaf. Give it a little bit more time and trust the process. Secondly, you can totally extend the bottom part and expect decent growth pretty quickly because of the established root system. The problem with the bottom part is not the time it takes for it to reshoot and then grow a new leaf. The problem with the bottom part is the bottom part. With Monstera, it's probably not such a big problem, but these leaves could easily now be a year older than some of these leaves on this plant. And yes, Monstera leaves can look okay for like maybe a year and a half or maybe up to 2 years and so, but you see that these are slowly deteriorating. Imagine the same principle with a philodendron verrucosum, where really the lifespan of a nice verrucosum leaf is maybe 6 months or so. By now the bottom part would be completely bare on a verrucosum, right? Similar to other velvet philodendron or even some anthuriums are climbers as well, right? The same would happen. I think Monsteras are unique in the way that their leaves have a really long lifespan, but the lifespan of the leaf is really the reason why I don't usually like to work with the bottom part, because these leaves are already ugly by the time of performing the chop and extend, or they're going to, well, deteriorate faster than this plant over here. So ultimately less chances of this being a nice looking display, but really I see the bottom part as a kickstart to start a new pole with this new shoot. Once this shoot grows another 3, 4, 5 nodes, right, I could technically chop it off and then basically discard the bottom part, or use the bottom part to do another kickstart for another pole and so on, right? So I feel like the bottom part is a kickstarter to grow a new healthy pole, because we're taking advantage of the existing root system already to just facilitate rather rapid growth, but it's not necessarily supposed to ever be a nice statement piece or look that good, you know. If you want 2 of the same plant, this is certainly an easy way of doubling the impact that you can make pretty quickly. And think about it, it just scales up from here. Once these 2 reach the top, I could cut both, re-extend all 4, then suddenly I have 4 of them. Next time around I'll have 8 of them, and so on, right? So you can very, very rapidly, more or less rapidly, but you can very quickly scale this up if you continue keeping both poles. I could definitely live in a Monstera jungle if I really wanted to, but I don't want to. Anyway, I hope I brought my point across, and I hope it answers the question what happens to the bottom part of my poles. Let me know in the comments down below if you've done a chop and extend before. Do you keep the bottom part? Do you keep the top part? Do you keep both? Do you take single node cuttings? How do you get the best out of these beautiful propagation benefits that moss poles offer? Let's start a conversation down below. Also make sure you give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!